Welcome to Houston House at South by Southwest. I'm Natalie Harms, editor of Innovation Map. Houston is a hub for medical device manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and R&D services. The region's biotech strength is powered by some of the world's top medical researchers, specialists, and clinical trials. Magnolia Tejas Corporation is part of the broader effort. I sat down with President David Schubert to talk about Houston's biotech ecosystem and efforts to establish Houston as the third coast for life sciences. David, thank you for joining me today. It's so nice to meet you and get to learn about what you do.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Natalie.
So let's just start off with Magnolia Tejas and what the company does and where that fabulous name came from.
So Magnolia Tejas is developing small molecule drugs that were created at MD Anderson through the Institute of Advanced Cancer Sciences in the laboratories of Jim Ray and under the direction of Phil Jones at the IACS. And we are working to develop therapeutics for an indication called chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathies. And peripheral neuropathies are something that occurs in many patients around the world in things like diabetes. Mm-hmm. And so it's a fairly common malady, but in particular, it is developed in patients who are undergoing chemotherapeutic regimens, particularly for agents that are utilizing therapies around platinum-based agents. And so patients who have ovarian cancer or breast cancer are oftentimes undergoing these very heavy chemotherapeutic regimens, and that causes them to develop these neuropathies. And neuropathies are pain and tingling associated in your extremities. Mm-hmm. And the common way to think about it is like if you're sitting funny and your leg falls asleep. But sometimes when your leg falls asleep, you can't stand up and walk because you can't feel your legs. That happens perpetually in patients that have chemotherapy and peripheral-induced neuropathies. And so it results in a lot of falls. It results in a lot of pain. And so it oftentimes, in about 30% of the cancer treatments, involves patients having to reduce the amount of chemotherapy that they're on, which then suboptimizes their therapeutic regimens. And so we're developing this suite of drugs to attempt to mitigate the symptoms associated with chemotherapy, with SIPN, the chemotherapeutic-induced peripheral neuropathies. As to the name is an homage to the city of Houston. Houston's the Magnolia City. Once upon a time, there were millions of magnolia that grew in this area, and the Tejas component is a reference to the original name of the state of Texas. And so we're a very Texas and Houston proud company. Yeah. So have you always worked in this field? Yeah, I figured out fairly early on in my career that I wanted to work in life sciences, and I started my career out at then what was the world's largest healthcare company, Baxter Healthcare Corporation, and was very fortunate to be assigned to their biotech group early on, and it clicked with me very quickly. But I've always been very passionate about working in oncology. My mother died from breast cancer, and so I've always been really focused on cancer therapeutic development. Yeah. So obviously, just by name alone, your company is very pro-Houston, but tell me a little bit about the biotech space in Houston. Well, I think Houston right now is in the beginnings, is in part of an emergence of the biotech industry. We've had a history of having a couple of successful companies here. The challenge has always been that once things become very successful here, someone buys them and takes them away, and that critical mass falls apart. There was a company called Tanox, developed by a real visionary in this town, Nancy Chang, who developed a company out of Baylor College of Medicine and was sold to Genentech for over $1 billion. And those therapies are on the market today treating allergy, for example. And we also see a history of technologies being developed by exceptional innovators like Malcolm Brenner at Baylor College of Medicine and the Center for Gene Therapy and Cell Therapy there, which get created into companies like Alavir, which was a Houston-based company, which gets drawn away and goes to Boston. And so I've always felt that this is a city where great things come from. But over the last several years, it appears as if we're starting to build critical mass, that this is a place where great things are, not just where they come from. Yeah, it's not particular to the life science industry that happens to, as I know it's like
very much talked about in other industries too, where you get some momentum and then you move to a bigger innovation hub. But what is unique about life sciences is it's a lot slower of a process to develop a life science or biotech company. So what needs to change to retain those really impressive companies in Houston? The million-dollar question, I'm sure. But
well, this will sound really simple, but we need a couple of successes under our belt where the critical mass actually stays, where someone buys the company and say, okay, we're going to leave that in place, or where we start having more and more successful serial entrepreneurs. I can promise you that there are serial entrepreneurs here in Houston. Malcolm Brenner was one I mentioned. The core of what is necessary is here. It's just that we have to keep pressing forward and developing these new technologies. And we have a great advantage in Texas by the mechanisms that are available through CPRIT, whether that be through grants to individual investigators, whether that be attracting world-class investigators to Houston. As a reminder, Jim Allison was drawn back to Houston, drawn back to Texas, and to MD Anderson on a CPRIT grant. And certainly we've seen, a migration of really great, talented scientists that have continued to come to Texas. With CPRIT being re-upped last year, we have a new pot of $3 billion to continue that flow of world-class cancer innovation coming to Texas.
Yeah. So you mentioned CPRIT, the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas. How does that entity work with your company and other life science companies?
CPRIT is a critical partner of ours in the development of our drug. We founded Magnolia in 2018 with a $31 million investment from our investors, which includes 4 of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies: Eli Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and AbbVie, and then world-class venture investors, Arch Venture Partners, and Alexandria Venture Investments. And then right on the heels of that, we announced that we had received a $20 million grant from CPRIT to develop our therapeutic into and beyond into phase 2. $20 million is a lot of money. In biotech world, you see financings of $100 or $200 million. Those things don't all come at once, and neither does that $20 million, but that grant is critical into being able to advance our product and being able to create reasonable economic outcomes for our investors who are taking extremely high risk at some of these early stages of development. And so our partnership with CPRIT is absolutely paramount to our desire to want to be here.
Of course, CPRIT is a huge asset to Texas, the larger Texas life science industry. But, both in Texas and in Houston specifically, what are the other ingredients that, we already have and maybe we're not utilizing enough?
The most critical anchor element we already have, which is we have world-class institutions that are part of the fabric of this city. I have to say MD Anderson first as my partners, but well beyond that, there is no better cancer center in the world than MD Anderson. MD Anderson is unique in that it has mechanisms inside of it that support physician scientists. People who are actually seeing patients are actually doing innovation. And that really makes a difference. MD Anderson also has the Institute for Advanced Cancer Studies, or IACS, which is really it's a biotechnology company that sits inside MD Anderson that is full of professional drug hunters. Phil Jones, who runs IACS, was at Merck for 25 years. This is a group of people that know how to make drugs. And so having that as a unique mechanism, there's nothing else like it anywhere in the US that's funded to that level, maybe anywhere in the world that's funded to the level that IACS is. And when we look around at the other institutions, certainly we're a town of competition, healthy. Often at times, if you look at our history in med device, whether that be the creation of the Texas Heart Institute, Denton Cooley, if you look at innovation that came from people like Red Duke in developing Life Flight, the second helicopter medical service in the country, certainly the largest. You look at universities like Rice, where I was very proud to work for 2.5 years. You have institutions of exception where innovation flows from. And it's not that it's not there. The question is how have we been tapping it? And, when I came to Houston in 2012 to work for Rice, with never any intention of going anywhere else. And I was drawn back to my partnership to open our New York office in 2014, and subsequently moved back there for 5 years. But the ecosystem has developed here substantially, and if I were to attribute that to things, it's to risk-taking that was not part of this city's fabric, which kind of sounds a little bit crazy because for many, many years, this city's been home to people that'll dig a hole in the ground to see if oil comes out of it. Mm-hmm. And that type of risk is acceptable, but life science risk was something that wasn't really understandable. What was known as that, as you mentioned earlier, it takes a long time, and it's really crazy expensive. And I give a lot of credit to the Texas Medical Center and the board of the Texas Medical Center initially developing the vision that was developed by Bobby Robbins and then carried on by his right-hand guy, Bill McKeon, who's now president at TMC, to really transform and take a hold of the life science innovation ecosystem that existed here in Houston, but it was just scattered into parts. And if you go over to the TMC Innovation Center, to TMCX, where it's also anchored with Johnson & Johnson's J Labs and the J&J Center for Device Intervention. Device. Can we cut that?
Yeah.
J&J's Center for Device Innovation. Those things didn't exist in 2016. And so I think what people look at now is when that vision was carried forward is that there was just some sort of just add water component to that. And really that was a visionary step that Bobby Robbins and Bill McKeon brought forth. And I think there's lots of kind of broader thinking that's being looked at right now with the development of TMC3, but there's also been, an emergence of the life science industry here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your perspective is extremely interesting because you were here, and then you weren't, and then you're here. So you really watched it change over the years. What was, for you, I guess, if you were looking at a particular moment that kind of brought on the most change, that impactful moment, and then what's the next moment that we need to work toward?
To be fair, I never really left.
Okay.
I mean, I've always had a place in Houston,
Yeah.
and so for the 5 years that I was gone, I always was back here on a very regular basis.
You can't get away.
Yeah, I mean, I love this city.
Yeah.
And I'm pleased with the change that has happened in my career by coming here. I've developed great friendships. I've worked with miraculously talented people, and I want to continue being here as this all continues to evolve. I mean, I would say that the development of the development of TMCX, and really a focus on an innovation program is certainly part of it. I think the second component of it is seeing how industry has started to spring up around it. Lonza, for example, is a major employer here now with a massive facility in Pearland that is only going to triple in size between now and 2025 in the cell therapy manufacturing space. And certainly there wasn't that level of commitment to that field when I was, cutting my teeth here in 2012 to 2014.
Yeah. So when you look at life science as a whole, of course, it's very vast. There's a bunch of different kind of sub-industries. But when it comes to oncology and cancer innovation, I feel like Houston is a really unique place to kind of grow a company. So do you think Houston really has this potential to be a cancer innovation hub?
Absolutely. And I think that we will continue to see things, as I was kind of mentioning before, the things that are from here. Mm-hmm. But the things that are going to continue to grow here. I think our capabilities in the cell therapy space, for example, are extremely high. If you look at the technology that's developed by the Rezvani lab at MD Anderson that signed a very substantial deal with Takeda around developing natural killer cells from umbilical cord blood, that kind of sounds like a really kind of cool idea that was dreamed up in a petri dish. That field's been evolving for 30 years when you have exceptional scientists like her and Dr. Spall that work in that center in the transplant medicine section. There's certainly a lot of innovation in oncology care that's going to come from those minds. And the greatest thing about the institutions that we have is that they continue to grow new people in their labs every year who are supposed to, leave and go off to another place, but many of them want to stay here at our institutions and develop a life and a family here.
Yeah. Well, it's a great city to do that. Maybe I'm biased, but for Houston kind of establishing itself as this third coast, we have a lot of the ingredients. We've talked about that, but really, now that we're taking these ingredients, maybe we're dedicating new resources to. We have different opportunities coming in. Where are we going as a city and as a life science innovation hub? Depending on who you ask, they might not consider Houston a life science innovation hub yet, but are we getting there?
I think we're getting there. Rewinding someone who will be watching this inevitably will remember that I made myself unpopular in 2012 or so when I got here, when I told people it wasn't a 5-year plan to turn Houston into a life science hub, and it wasn't a 10-year plan. It was more like a 30-year plan. Well, that's 9 years ago. And there's a couple of other things that have happened where the world has changed substantially. Certainly, as we look at the last year or so being in lockdown and we're not sitting in Austin having this conversation, COVID and the response to it has changed everything about the way that people think about where they have to be and where that companies are based. And certainly the life science industry has grown remarkably through this period. But even if over the last 5 years, a dramatic amount of money has been deployed into life sciences. And we're looking harder at more revolutionary rather than evolutionary therapies. And people are willing to expend more monies on higher potential return prospects, but making sure that things stay on track and there's enough professional development of people in the area to push forward with these programs. And I think you've seen it with the migration to Texas. Certainly people are not feeling as if they have to stay living in Boston or have to stay living in San Francisco and don't want to. And I think further, as odd as this sounds, in the city where we have massive infrastructure and land in all directions, we're out of land in my hometown of Seattle, Washington. There's just no lab space anymore. There's no place to put it. Cambridge, there's no lab space. 5 years in New York, they're starting to build more lab space, but it's the most expensive in the world. And San Francisco is overexpanded. And one of the things that has happened from COVID is you would think that in most other industries, people want to reduce their footprint. Well, lab space, they require more footprint because you have to socially distance people. And when you work in a lab, there's no working from home. And so I think there's going to be a lot of alternatives in looking towards other places to develop. And certainly with the institutions that we have in place, with MD Anderson, with Baylor College of Medicine, with institutions in and around med device, Houston becomes far more attractive. And it's also, when you think about cost of living and attractiveness of living and quality of life initiatives that we've come to take for granted in Texas for years, people are starting to ring a little bit more true into that certain things matter a lot more than they used to.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about Houston as a whole and life science as a whole, but tell me a little bit about where Magnolia Tejas is going, what you're focusing on now, and what 2021 really means for you.
2021 is a critical year as we move forward as a company. We are looking to file our IND, which would allow us to put our lead molecule into human beings. We want to do that by the end of this year. Those are large inflection points for drug companies, so we can start beginning to see what the performance of our drug is in human beings. It's been a 3-year odyssey with our partners at MD Anderson, who have we couldn't have asked for better partners, but it's go time. And so we're really excited about putting our drugs in patients. Our first patients will be here in the state of Texas.
Yeah. So I assume the pandemic has at least made some sort of impact on your business, as it has made a huge impact on the industry. So what have you observed from COVID-19 and the impact it made?
So I think from an industry perspective, without exception, every company that I know of private, but then if you look at every public company and their disclosures and SEC documents, it's lengthened out everyone's timeline. Because when you think about simple things like I'm accruing a patient into a clinical trial and I want you to come to the hospital that I work at, your first response to that is I don't want to come to your hospital because I don't want to be near a doctor's office, or, well, but you're sick and you need to be treated. Yeah, I get that, but I don't necessarily want to be there longer than I need to. So clinical trial enrollment has slowed down. During the height of the pandemic, it started to bounce back a little bit now. Of course, timelines stretching out means costs stretch out, and biotechnology companies traditionally just burn and burn and burn money. They don't make money until an exit, whether that be by going public or a trade sale. So the clinical aspect has slowed. Preclinical development, which has largely been outsourced in our country. Now, it's not to say that there isn't companies within the country that do preclinical development, but by and far, preclinical development is going on much larger in China, India to a certain extent, and some extent to the UK. That has led to a dramatic slowdown in timelines as well, because the pandemic just didn't happen in the United States. It started in China, it came to the United States, and all of those timelines got stretched out as well. And so the industry, of course, will be needing more money. The good news is over the last few years, and today when I walked in here, the industry was still being able to reap very large amounts of money in private investment. But the impact to the drug approvals will be felt for the next several years to come.
That's incredible to think about, because I think when I think about the pandemic's effect, it's almost like we hit fast forward on some aspects of, healthcare in general, like telehealth, producing a vaccine in less than a year. So, but the impact kind of longer term is incredibly profound, it sounds like.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the impacts of COVID obviously stretch from people not going to do the wellness checks at the doctor. We know cancer screening is down substantially. Wow. But we also know that people not being able to be in the lab, or having everybody being in the lab for extended periods of time. Drug development is a very collaborative experience. And the Zoom calls that we've had for the last year are not nearly as enjoyable as sitting in a conference room at MD Anderson with my colleagues. And so there's still going to be a lot of reverberations, I think, as we go down the line and see things take longer than we otherwise would have expected. And certainly then there's the other aspect of it, which things that we don't know. When we look at, how quickly the vaccine was developed, which is an amazing testament to the life sciences industry in this country and to clinical investigators. But we don't know how COVID, or having the vaccine or not having the vaccine, is going to affect how drugs work or don't work. How are we going to find that out? We're going to find out over time by doing larger studies and seeing what the boxes that you're going to be checking off at your medical appointments going forward is. I've had COVID, I haven't had COVID. I had my vaccine, I haven't had my vaccine. When was the last time you had one? And so we're going to be learning that during that process as well.
More paperwork. Can't wait.
Indeed, absolutely.
It sounds like it's definitely a game of wait and see. So as we move into this, what are you closely watching?
As far as
the impact of COVID and all these additional kind of questions you have about where we're headed.
I think about it from a drug development perspective. There's going to be systemic changes that are going to be permanent. Certain drugs are already incredibly expensive to develop. The prices of things for developing your drugs have just gone substantially higher. In some of our cases, it's double as we shift some of our work to the United States. And so that's going to have a substantial effect on budgets and how much money companies have to raise. And we're going to be, we've always been wrestling with the cost of developing these drugs and the risk associated with it. It's going to have a bit of a pin in it, I think, as we look at substantially higher costs than what we had imagined, a year or two ago.
Yeah, keeping an eye on the dollar signs.
This is an expensive business to be in, and the worst thing is running out of money when you have a really promising drug. And there's a saying where if it's a problem that money can solve, it's not a problem. Well, the problem is that in the world of musical chairs that we've seen throughout the years of the economy, we don't know when that musical chair is going to stop, and you're not going to be able to raise money for a really promising drug candidate. And so as a part of a firm that looks across a number of drugs and then things that we're developing on behalf of our investors. It's certainly something to keep an eye on.
I may or may not be picturing doctors playing musical chairs now. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Very interested to see where Magnolia Tejas is going.
Thanks. It's been my pleasure.